getting kicked out of the house. It's wild how certain moments in life can feel simultaneously devastating and liberating. For me, that moment came when my own parents essentially shoved me out of their house, telling me that they would be happier if I took my new wife and left. Ironically, that same eviction opened the door to the first real sense of relief and independence I've ever felt. On one hand, I'm overwhelmed, crying inside as I reflect on how much damage their treatment caused. But on the other hand, I'm finally free. In the grand scheme of things, maybe this was the push I needed. To understand why leaving my parents was such a turning point, you have to know a bit about my background. The tension started quite literally the moment I was born. My parents wanted a girl, so throughout my mother's pregnancy, that's what they convinced themselves they would get it. In our country, prenatal tests cannot reveal the baby's sex, so they had no confirmation. The day I came into the world, my father and mother were completely thrown. I was not only a boy, but I was born with some deformities that made my appearance less than perfect in their eyes. Instead of showering me tenderness, they responded with palpable disappointment. Growing up, relatives would recount how my parents said openly that I was a letdown from day one. I've heard it enough times to know they weren't exaggerating. Maybe that first disappointment planted the seed for all that followed. 2 years later, my younger sister arrived. Exactly what my parents had yearned for. Suddenly, the sun rose and set on her. She was like their prized gem. Never disciplined harshly, seldom even scolded, and always treated with adoration. Looking back, it felt like an enormous gulf separated us. My sister, the cherished daughter, could do no wrong, while I, somehow labeled the unwanted child, was perpetually in the doghouse for the smallest infraction. And my parents weren't content to let their disappointment simmer quietly. They used physical and mental abuse to drive the point home. They had an arsenal of punishments that they doled out, apparently oblivious to how damaging it might be for a kid. I remember so many nights getting whacked with a belt for minor mistakes, being forced to do humiliating squats, or being made to sit like a chair with no back support, arms raised, for extended periods. Sometimes, if a teacher or neighbor complained about me, no matter how small or possibly exaggerated the complaint, my father would erupt. He'd use the belt, or he'd employ that dreaded chair punishment, or he might have me do 100 squats on the spot. On the worst occasions, he went even further. One time, and it seared into my memory, he yanked off my clothes and shoved me out of the house. I was just entering puberty, had body hair starting to appear, and I remember standing outside, cold and terrified, feeling unbelievably exposed. My grandfather, who lived nearby, happened upon the scene and rescued me. Thank goodness for him. Without his intervention, I don't know how far it would have gone. Oddly enough, that particular punishment never repeated, but it left a scar. The message was clear. I was worthless in my father's eyes, an object to be disciplined and humiliated, not a son to be loved. As I aged, the pattern continued. I internalized the idea that I was a misfit, the one who wrecked their dreams. They wanted a perfect little princess, and they got me, a boy who wasn't even physically typical in their view. My sense of self-worth plummeted. Unsurprisingly, my grades in school weren't stellar. I was far too nervous, always second-guessing myself, dreading any small failure that might bring down my parents' wrath. The environment at home was so oppressive that it left me with no mental space to truly focus on academic success. I was full of anxiety and self-doubt. Meanwhile, my sister breezed through life, receiving gentle encouragement and never facing any real conflict. We were like night and day. Despite all this, I somehow stumbled into adulthood. I had a decent job, learned how to interact with people, kept my scars hidden behind a polite smile. When it came time for marriage, my parents orchestrated an arranged match, just how it's often done in our culture. I agreed, partly out of a sense of obligation, partly because I desperately wanted acceptance from them for once, and partly because I'd almost been programmed to do what they said. The woman I married, who would become my wife, didn't know the depth of the dysfunction in my home. She entered with hope, imagining she'd be part of a supportive, loving family. Little did she know how quickly that dream would be shattered. From the moment she arrived in our home, my parents turned their negativity onto her. She became the new target for their mental and emotional jabs, though it was more underhanded than overt. They'd criticize her cooking, her housekeeping, her manners, or her attire, often in subtle ways. When I was at work, they'd unleash. They wouldn't physically harm her. That wasn't in their playbook with a daughter-in-law, apparently. But psychologically, they put her through the ringer. They wanted us both to feel unwelcome, as though we were leeches in Their house. My father would ridicule her for small mistakes. My mother would compare her to my sister in belittling ways, and so on. Over time, my wife's health declined. She lost weight, became gaunt, started looking perpetually exhausted, yet she rarely mentioned specifics to me. I was so numb to my own parents' behavior that I didn't pick up on the severity of it. 18 months went by like that. One day, my wife finally reached her breaking point. In tears, she unloaded every vile thing my parents had said or done when I wasn't around. I felt simultaneously furious, ashamed, and heartbroken. Furious at my parents for repeating the same brutality they'd inflicted on me. Ashamed that I had unknowingly put her in this environment imagining she'd be fine. Heartbroken because it was a grim replay of my own childhood, living in an atmosphere of relentless criticism and emotional abuse. I remember that day vividly. My wife admitted she'd tried to tough it out because, in many conservative households, you don't just walk away or file complaints. You try to adapt, to keep the peace, but she was deteriorating physically and mentally. Hearing her stories, I realized I could no longer stand by. I might have tolerated abuse toward myself out of a lifetime of conditioning, but I couldn't let my wife suffer the same. So the next morning, I confronted my parents, something I'd basically never done. My heart pounded as I told them we wanted to move out. I expected them to fume, to lash out, to deliver one more round of condemnation. Instead, they were oddly calm, almost smug. They said, "Good. It's for the best." They practically shoved us out the door as if we'd been a nuisance all along. It's painful to recall the scorn in their eyes, yet also strangely freeing. Looking back, I realized that was the best thing that ever happened. Being kicked out forced me to stop trying to please them and instead focus on building a life with my wife, free from their negativity. We managed to find a modest place of our own. Yes, I struggle financially now. Rent, bills, basic living expenses, none of it is easy. But every day I come home to a space that's calm, where no one's hurling insults or picking fights for no reason. My wife can finally breathe, rest, eat, without tension gripping her stomach. She's gradually regaining her health and sense of self. We can laugh, talk openly, and help each other heal. It's bittersweet. Part of me grieves the fact that I never experienced the love or protection that children should receive from their parents who they made it painfully clear I was unwanted from the start. That reality stings. When I see how my in-laws treated me, albeit for a short period before they passed away, I got a glimpse of genuine parental warmth. They had welcomed me kindly, gave me emotional support, and viewed me as a person with potential, not a disappointment or a burden. I'll always treasure those memories, even though they were too brief. Now, I'm in my early adulthood basically relearning how a family is supposed to function. I have to remind myself that discipline can be done with words, not beatings, that love doesn't revolve around scorn. My father's brand of tough love was neither love nor particularly helpful. It was just cruelty that left deep psychological bruises. And my mother, though less physically violent, was complicit in letting it all happen. I sometimes wonder about the future. Will I attempt to reconcile with my parents later on? Will they ever apologize or even acknowledge the harm they did? Given the pattern of disdain they've shown, I suspect not. They're set in their ways. They believe they've done nothing wrong, that I deserved all the punishments, that I was the defective one. I've come to terms with the possibility that they'll never change. Maybe I'll remain estranged from them, or maybe I'll keep a minimal channel open for courtesy's sake, but never let them back into the center of my life. What's clear is that the best thing they ever did for me was push me to go away. By cutting off that toxic environment, they unwittingly gave me and my wife a shot at building something healthier. Sure, finances are tight, but with the mental stress lifted, I can focus on improving my career, or maybe picking up side gigs. My wife can reclaim her optimism and set her own goals. Without the constant fear of parental intrusion, we can bond and develop our relationship on our own terms. And if we choose to have children, we'll know precisely how not to treat them. We'll ensure they never endure the savage punishments that my father considered normal. We'll show them acceptance, no matter their abilities, achievements, or physical attributes, and we'll break the cycle of generational trauma in the process. Sometimes I reflect on my father's hypocrisy. If you treat a child cruelly, what do you expect when you're old and need assistance? My father's known for telling me things like, "You'll regret ever disappointing me," but ironically, he may be the one who ends up alone in regret. That's not something I say with spite. It's just the logical outcome of how he's chosen to behave. If he ever shows genuine remorse, I might be open to partial forgiveness, because harboring hate poisons the soul. But I won't subject myself or my wife to fresh waves of toxicity. To anyone reading this who might be struggling with abusive relatives, please know you're not alone, and that leaving a toxic situation, if you can manage it safely, might be the turning point you need. It's scary. There's no sugarcoating that. Financial difficulties, emotional confusion, and the residual guilt that family can impose are real obstacles. But believe me when I say that a life free from daily abuse is worth it. Even if your budget is tight or you have to start from scratch, you discover your own strength, your capacity for joy, and new ways to cope and flourish. Moreover, if you have children or plan to, remember that they look to you for safety and acceptance. Don't repeat the mistakes of parents like mine who let disappointment overshadow their basic duty of care. A child's soul is fragile. The scars from belittling or physical harm can last for decades, if not a lifetime. Show them kindness, guide them firmly yet respectfully. Let them know that unconditional love is real, that they're not worthless or defective. And maybe if more families treated kids with genuine warmth, fewer people would end up carrying invisible wounds into adulthood. In the end, I stand by the title of this confession. Getting kicked out by my parents was the best thing that could have happened to me. It stripped away illusions, forced me to confront the reality of who they are, and gave me a chance to protect my wife from further harm. It also taught me that freedom, though it might come with struggles, is infinitely better than living under a roof of constant fear and bitterness. Every day I work on building a life that's truly mine and creating a household that thrives on respect rather than intimidation. And even though I'm still crying inside about the family love I never had, I'm also hopeful that I can give that love to others, especially to my future children, proving to myself that cycles of abuse can end with me.